Uh, Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I'm repeating myself because recording just started. It's really nice for us to have you all here. Thank you for being part of this event. It's an absolute pleasure that we have speakers at this event, particularly Claire Knowles, who's going to talk about the implementation and the preparation for implementation of a policy, but also Rachel Bruce, who's the head of open research at UKRI, who will talk about the implementation and the design of the policy. Thank you to everyone who sent their questions in advance, but feel free to add your questions through the Q&A section throughout this webinar as well. And last but not least, this session is being recorded and it will be shared afterwards with all of you and all of the registered participants as well. My name is Masood Kokar. I'm the University Librarian and Keeper of Resident Collection here at the University of Leeds. And I'm also the Vice Chair of Research Libraries UK. One other role I have, which might be important for today's discussions, is that I am a member of the University's UK JISC Content Negotiation Strategy Group, which looks after all the major publishing agreements in line with the implementation of national policies, for example, the UKRI open access policy. So I'm really, really pleased that we are all here talking about this extremely important topic on the UKRI open access policy and its implementation. As many of you know, the policy has now been in implementation for, I think, just over a month now. And it's really important that we are able to ask all the questions, clarify all the issues behind this, because this is the direction that we are all going in, a much more open access world. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that stuck with me throughout this policy as well, and then give a chance to elaborate more on that through Claire and Rachel as well. Firstly, I was really pleased that the policy supports both green and gold publishing routes. I think that's an acknowledgement of both routes being equally important in the scheme of larger things and in the scheme of publishing, and that no one option is better than the other. And I was really pleased to see that. I think what I was also very pleased about was that the policy is looking at open access publishing in a sustainable fashion. It's not looking at a complete radical shift to a just green or just gold. I think it's giving options to all of us. And I think that's a really important thing, because through that, it's actually sustainable for organizations, it's sustainable for publishing industry as well. And whether you love the publishing industry, you hate the publishing industry, or you're right in the middle of that spectrum, they are a really important part in this conversation and in our collective future for publishing. The other thing that I've picked up on is some shifts that have happened in the industry since the UKRI open access policy was being developed. So those of us who were more involved in the transformative agreement side, we've seen a rapid increase in the UK-wide transformative agreements. And I can say this with quite some confidence that the UKRI open access policy and the consultation period that led to this policy would have really supported that acceleration. And why that's really important to me, because we've always got this sustainability question about how do we control costs within reasonable bounds, but also how do we accelerate open access? And actually these read and publish agreements are doing just that for the time being. Whether that's the right long-term outcome, I think that's a question we are still thinking about and questioning within research organizations. And I'm sure that's a question that UK as a whole would be looking at. But nonetheless, it's a really important step in that transition. Another thing I really like in the policy is that it pushes for standards and scalability. It's not afraid of asking for standards. It's actually saying that this is an important aspect of the policy, and that everything we do will have to scale in relation to that. So I really like that part. Personally, and I know many members of my team would be really happy about this as well, the kind of lessening of burden or through simplified monitoring and evaluation is much appreciated. We know that the policy is only the first step. As we implement it, it increased pressures on all of us in how we manage it, how we monitor compliance, how we report that back to UKRI, all of those things. So a simplified approach towards that, I think, has been really, really nice to see. It's really nice to see that monographs are being clearly highlighted. While they are not in the scope right now, they are definitely in the scope from 2024 onwards. And what really excited me was the 12-month embargo period. I think it could have been a lot longer. It could have created different kind of issues, but actually a really focused approach on 12-month embargo from publication is allowed, but after that it has to be open access is a very clear direction on where monographs are going in the future as well. And last but not least, a re-emphasized direction towards open data. It's very much highlighted. And the mandatory nature of data access statements is really important in that regard. So there are lots and lots of really good things that we really wanted to do for quite some time, to embed a different culture, to really change the way research is being looked at. And all of those things have been picked up through that extensive consultation which happened last year, and then the development of the policy as an outcome of that. I won't say anything more about the policy development because I'm sure Rachel will be adding more to that, but those were some of the points I wanted to mention. The second thing I want to mention before I hand over to others is this is a major step forward. We cannot underestimate the importance of this in the transition to open access. It is allowing us as research organizations to move forward within the controlled research envelopes of budgets, but also allowing the publishers to transition with us. It is a long-term gain. It is a long-term aim as well, but nonetheless, this would actually shift the landscape tremendously in the right direction. And I really want to highlight what a major step forward this is. But what I also like, and I know that this is being looked at as well, is that it's also focusing not just on the standard ways of publishing, but also alternative ways of supporting communities and learning societies and publishing agencies to think differently. And that's through community-led support for community-led initiatives. That's through support for new publishing platforms and ventures like Octopus. There is a lot going on in that area, and I think that's all really positive step forward as well. That's all I really wanted to say in terms of the policy. You're not here to really listen to me. You're really here to listen to the experiences of Claire and the conversation from Rachel. So I just wanted to say thank you. It's a really, really important area. I hope you work with us and ask us questions, comments. This is quite an interactive thing, so please do add your comments in chat, your questions in the Q&A section. And what we will do is we'll pick those up and actually ask those from Rachel and Claire at the end of the session. Claire, I will now hand over to you, and Claire will talk about the perspective on the policy implementation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Masood. Can everybody see my slides? And can you see just my slides?
We can see your slides, Claire.
Yes. So I'm going to say a bit about our planning and preparation for the new UKRI open access policy here at Leeds before we hand over to Rachel. So what have we been doing here at Leeds? So one of the main things has been communication, and that's been communication when the consultation was underway, communication in preparation for the 1st of April date, communication afterwards, etc., and by whatever means we can. And that has included emails to grant holders, updating our website, papers going through committees, webinars like today's that we've held, going along to meetings both within schools and faculties and research groups, and also holding events during our research culture cafes for people to come along and ask questions, and the general communication of responding to questions and inquiries. And this communication is part of this event today and will continue because it's very much leading up to the policy implementation and then supporting people as the policy becomes more of a reality for them on submission. So it's an ongoing piece of work for us, the communications. And what have we been communicating? Well, we've picked up 5 key policy changes, some of which Masood has mentioned there. The big one is the immediate open access, so no embargoes, immediate open access, and the changes that means for open access. The license changes, rights retention, the 2 routes, which lead with the green and gold, which people are aware of. I think communications has also made aware for us, as we need to be constantly reminded that some of the language we use when you're day-to-day in the open access landscape isn't always the language that others use. Hybrid journals, a lot of work here at Leeds at looking at where we are publishing in hybrid journals that will no longer be compliant or won't be compliant going forwards if we don't get transformative deals. And the notification about licenses on submission, and especially what CC BY means, what that is. We've also created a checklist for what research should do. So this is very much what to do before submission. A huge thanks to everybody behind the journal checker tool that we've been encouraging people to use and encouraging people to get in contact with us if they think, oh, what exactly does that mean, or is that right? So huge thanks to Cottage Labs and everybody behind the journal checker tool. The rights retention, being clear what that means, where you put it. Huge thanks to everybody in the library who manages our article processing through the UKRI block grant and answers the questions when they come in and support those. The changes to page and colour charges that have come through, and the deals. So once again, huge thanks to the team in subscriptions who get the deals in place and make those available, and making sure that people understand what deals we have, what's included and what isn't. And that's where it is a really complex situation in this transformation period. So next has been the renewed focus on research data management that we've been helping people to understand. And I'll come on next slide about some of what we've done for that, but making sure that people are aware what that means and the inclusion, even if you don't have your data somewhere to share, that you do need to make that explicit. And then the final thing on the checklist has been what to do when you've been accepted. And that's where the records that go into Symplectic, our research information system, and then are made available on the White Rose Research Online, our shared repository with our White Rose partners. And we've added some boxes and drop downs onto Symplectic so we can know if the rights retention statement's been included and if a data access statement. So huge thanks to the team for getting that up and running, and our colleagues in IT. And that will help us understand when people are using these that have come through in the new policy. So we did lots of planning and brainstorming and created Padlets of what it would mean for us and preparing for the policy coming through. But often it is when you actually have things working in practice and you work through those scenarios that you think, oh, what exactly does that mean? And this is where we are in a transforming landscape. Read and publish deals, you know, it's great that we've got the Elsevier deal now, but that was sort of coming through as we were preparing. Of the deals are still being discussed, so IEEE being one of those, which is we've been asked questions about. So it is where we're having to make sure we keep information up to date, make people aware of what the situation is, particularly in those publishers that are really relevant to their discipline. We're doing work on rights retention, and what does that mean if we wanted to extend along the Edinburgh model, and also preparation for monographs. 2024 isn't very far away, is it? The days and weeks whiz by. The technical requirements underway once again with our White Rose colleagues, and huge thanks to John Salter, who's been implementing those in our repository. It's great to see the additional funding that's come through from UKRI. Huge thanks to Nick, who's organising today, for the work he's been doing around Octopus and support for that and getting feedback to that to Octopus. We work in a collaborative area, so this is huge for us. What does it mean when there's co-authors that aren't in the UK, etc.? And that's been lots of the questions that I'm sure will be coming through later to Rachel about the collaborative nature of our research. but also the collaborative nature of our research support. So yeah, huge thanks to all of our colleagues. So those JISC mailing lists have been busy, haven't they, with questions coming through. And also, what does this mean for inclusive research? To make sure that we have routes to open access to everybody. And that's where it's great to see rights retention comes through so strongly in the UKRI policy. And that is a route to open for everybody, no matter how they are funded. And also exploring opening up so it's beyond beyond the journal articles with conference proceedings, around preprints, data and monographs coming through. So that's great to see come forward in the policy as well. And lastly, I just want to say once again, a huge thanks to everybody for the collaborative nature in which we work on implementing these policies. It's great to see people sharing their experiences, their communications, coming along to these sort of events and sharing what it's meant for them in practice. And huge thanks to UKRI and Rachel for coming along and telling us more and answering lots and lots of questions that come through around the implementation. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. We'll pick up the questions later in the session, but in the meantime, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Rachel Bruce, the head of open research at UKRI, to come and talk with us about the UKRI open access policy. Rachel, thank you so much for your time. I know people are really excited to listen to you to understand how the policy was designed, but also how it's going to be supported through UKRI. So thank you so much for your time. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Masood, and also Claire. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you to the White Rose Consortium for hosting the event. So I will now attempt to share my screen. So let's see if we can get that sorted, shall we? I think that is working. Let me just see. Sorry. Does that seem to be working for everybody?
It's not in slideshow, Rachel. So
it's not in slideshow, right? It is for me. So no, still not.
Well, while you're looking at that, I can reassure the audience that you did test it just before the session and it all worked fine. So this is what happens at times with technical situation. Do you want to, oh, all working now? Yeah.
It's working now, yes.
It's working now, but it's not on slide one. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Rachel.
Right, I am so sorry. I don't quite know what's going on with the settings on my computer. Right. Good morning, everyone, again. And yeah, thanks for having me. So as Masood said, I will talk about some of the policy formation and how we came to the policy, outline what the policy is, and some of the supporting actions around the policy. We have, of course, as Masood said, we've now, for research articles, the policy's been running for about 6 weeks, I suppose, or maybe is it 7? Goodness, I should be able to count weeks. And so we are getting an idea of, you know, some of the reoccurring issues in terms of the questions. Our inbox has been very busy, so I'll reflect on a few of the key issues that people are raising as well at the end. So just to place really the open access policy within the broader UKRI strategy. So we recently published our new strategy that runs up to 2027, and in it we are very clear about the need for change so that there is a resilient research and innovation sector, and looking at these principles of diversity, connectivity, resilience and engagement, and those important principles running through all of our work. And within the UKRI Strategy Directorate, and so one of the key areas of strategic change is what we term research culture and environment. So in our research culture and environment group, which is where open research sits, we are looking collectively also with our colleagues that take forward equality, diversity and inclusion strategies and policies, research integrity, and also research and innovation culture. So those 4 elements, if you like, are seen as important aspects to the research culture and environment. And we have a policy, but also a change programme across all of the activities that UKRI supports. So collectively working in partnership nationally and globally to try and make those change for research and innovation to be, I suppose, the best it can be and to reach all of the goals it should in terms of benefiting society, education and economy. So in terms of open research, we really see our activities covering 3 priorities depicted here. One is open access that we're talking about today, the supposedly straightforward open access to publication, which we all know is not as straightforward as we would like. And then open data, and I call that open data plus, because obviously thinking about code, algorithms, methods, and other assets that should be more open and transparent. And then open culture, and that really focuses on incentivizing and rewarding open research practice, and also working with our colleagues in talent and skills and our digital research infrastructure colleagues in terms of being able to support roles and invest in skills development to be able to support open research, or modern research, as we might say. So in terms of the open access policy, which has been the first priority within our strategy for open research, we started the review back in 2018. I can't quite believe it took that long. And that really just reflects, I think, what a contentious area open access can be. So we took great care with the open access review, with a lot of stakeholder engagement, taking into account a whole range of different views from a whole range of different stakeholders, be they commercial publishers, researchers, government, and obviously, of course, universities, as well as other research funders, and as well as small independent publishers. So a whole different range of stakeholder views were taken into account. What we were aiming for was to move on from our existing open access policy that we've had in the UK for our research councils and many other bodies, but our research council policy, of course, was introduced in 2012, but there was, although a preference for immediate open access, embargoed open access was accepted. So what we were really doing here was trying to move forward and push towards immediate open access. And in the review, in our early consultation, it was quite clear there was no middle ground. It was immediate open access that we were seeking for research articles. But then also, as we were scoping the review, thinking about other disciplines, we broadened the scope to include humanities and long form outputs. Key considerations were really looking at, as far as possible, trying to be aligned across UK policy environment. So there was a lot of engagement with the devolved funders around the research excellence framework to make sure that anything that we did, they were consulted, and so we can seek for alignment so things are as easy as possible for researchers and research organisations in implementation, but also working internationally, recognising publishing is international, but more importantly for us, of course, research is international. So moving in a way in which the other stakeholders around the globe are also progressing. With that, I recognise, there are differences, and I know there have been questions about that. So Some of the key considerations, I would say there are 3 key considerations that we looked at very carefully in the review. And they were, I think Masood has really highlighted the one around affordability. So to actually achieve immediate open access, but to be able to do that in a way that we can constrain costs and that it can be affordable for the UK research sector was a key consideration. Also in that, we know that there would have to be some change. There always is, I suppose, some grit in the oyster. And so that would therefore have the potential of restricting author choice. So we took author choice very seriously. And in the review, analysed carefully the publication venues that UKRI authors publish in over long periods of time, so that we could assess whether or not the policy would constrain author choice too much. And obviously we concluded with our policy result that author choice was a key consideration, and that we have actually produced a policy where there are a number of publishing options. With that, I accept that there's always going to be, I think as Duncan Wingham says, you know, there's always going to be some eggs that are broken when you're making an omelette. So, you know, this is a change process. And then the third key consideration was around sustainability, and that again, sustainability for the research sector, but also sustainability for the whole variety of different publishing options as well. So we took care in terms of looking at economic analysis and making sure that the changes that we made would not disrupt any of the players too significantly. So with all of those considerations, and just as we were going through the review, the government re-articulated its commitment to open research, but importantly, the fact that publicly funded research should be open access and that should be mandated. So our policy is actually a practical implementation of that government ambition. And in UKRI, as the largest public funder within the UK, we take the lead role within government organisations in implementing open access and broader open research. And we've been working very closely with departments such as the Department of Health and Social Care and FCDO in the development of their open access policies, again, with that goal of trying to be as aligned as far as possible, albeit sectors do have differences. So what does the policy apply to? My slides are jumping. As I've said, research publications. So what we are concerned with are peer-reviewed research articles submitted from the 1st of April. And that does include reviews and conference proceedings. And then we've broadened the policy, as has been mentioned, to monographs, book chapters and edited collections, although that policy doesn't start until 2024. I think in terms of the research articles policy, I'd just like to emphasise that whilst I recognise there are challenges in implementation, and the policy itself, I think, is really quite simple, and you know, it's immediate open access with a CC BY licence, and we have attempted to be as permissive as possible in terms of the routes to meeting that overarching policy aim. And with regards to that, Masood has mentioned really that, you know, the policy accepts both what's called often called gold and often called green. So publishing via formal publishing routes and journals with your version of record, or via repositories. And so in our policy, we call them Route 1 and Route 2, Route 1 being the version of record via journals or publishing platforms, and Route 2 being either the version of record the publisher permits, or most probably the author accepted manuscript in a repository at the time of final publication. And in order to achieve Route 2, we ask authors to put a standard text within their manuscripts so that it's clear when they make a submission that they will be applying a CC BY license to the author accepted manuscript. I should just say on that, you know, wording isn't completely strict. As long as the wording and the statement in the paper is to meet that goal, then that's acceptable. In terms of long form publications, again, we've taken a similar approach, being as permissive as possible, recognising both the version of record or an author accepted manuscript. And I'm sure we will learn lots of lessons there within the long form space, because author accepted manuscript is, I suppose, a bit of a new concept there, but we consulted widely on it, and that seemed to be the best approach in terms of implementation of the policy. With the 12-month embargo being accepted. And whilst it's a Creative Commons license, of course, very permissive here, so any Creative Commons license can be applied, so non-commercial is acceptable. We do say in the policy and make it quite clear that when it is the author accepted manuscript being deposited, it should be very clear that that is not the final published version. And there are many exceptions within the policy around third-party rights, and then there are exceptions in terms of the scope, in terms of where the policy applies. For support the policy, so with all of those considerations about affordability, sustainability, we needed, and author choice, we needed to consider what sorts of supporting actions might we put in place, recognising that we, you know, this is a change. All stakeholders are making a change, albeit that we have been preparing for this for some time. We needed to assess what sorts of supporting actions might we put in place. So one of them, I suppose the obvious one really, is the funding support. And we increased our block grant for open access from what was £24 million per annum to 46.7 million per annum. And the basis and argument for that was that we felt that introducing immediate open access, it was, you know, UKRI needed to ensure that it provided a fair share and contribution to meet that policy aim. And we also looked at the proportion of research funding, and so that had increased since the last policy was introduced. So the case was made, and we were very pleased that we have secured this funding for the open access policy in what is quite a tough negotiation environment for public funding, as I'm sure you all appreciate, for this spending review period. Within that funding allocation, there's also an earmarked fund for the long form policy. So not all of that is for research articles. This year, the block grant that has been allocated to research organisations totals £40 million. So it's a substantial increase. But that again was made within the context of these read and publish and transformative agreements, where we were really seeing evidence of them constraining costs and driving costs down. And as we were finalising the policy, more and more of those agreements were being struck and signed, and a higher proportion of UKRI author output covered by those agreements. But with that, we recognise that there is a whole range of different research organisations, so different specialisms and sizes, and also the same for publishers. And so that is why we have actually supported JISC with additional funds. So they've got more negotiators and more resource to make sure that there's information analysis and advice and guidance in place to extend what would be called eligible open access options for UKRI funding across diverse range of publishers and for a diverse range of research performing organisations. Claire's already mentioned, so we've also developed tools and things so authors and research organisations can see what journal options there are and publishing options. And we are just about, I'm hopeful that they go out next week. I keep saying that, so let's pray it happens next week, that we'll send out the invites to our stakeholder forums. So in terms of, we've undertaken, as I think has probably come across, loads of stakeholder engagement, and that will continue as the policy goes through implementation, and we are establishing a stakeholder forum as well. So there is a formal route for collaboration, which is also important, as Claire has emphasised. So in terms of that funding and eligible costs for the block grant, overall our aim is for institutions to use their discretion and obviously to see the block grant as one contribution to support open access within their organisations. And largely, the block grant can be used to cover any costs that the research organisation sees as justifiable in terms of meeting the aims of the policy, albeit those costs have to be auditable and they have to be proportionate. So, of course, with that in mind, research organisations have to make appropriate arrangements and judgments. But what I suppose I'm saying is, you know, you can support the repository route, you can support staff that are associated, you can also support a range of different open access models. But there is one restriction on those funds, and that is for hybrid publishing. And that is because those, you know, the cost of hybrid publishing do push up. And as I've emphasised, affordability and sustainability have been really important. And so there is that restriction that UKRI funds can only be used in hybrid publishing subscription journals if they are part of a transition agreement or a transformative journal. So only if it is part of a sector agreed agreement via the JISC governed processes can you use those funds. And there are actually some, so subscribe to open as well. So actually we should change some of our wording here. So subscribe to open, such as scope 3, is also eligible for funding. We have made available various resources. So our FAQ is growing. I hope it stops growing soon. And so here are just URLs really to the information online. And it's continually updated. I should also mention, because I haven't yet, that of course there is the ND exception with the research articles policy. And so the process there's the link, is to submit a form via email. And it should be fairly lightweight, as Masood has emphasised. We have tried as far as possible to cut down administration and to be as lightweight as we can. And then working with JISC and also the Plan S Journal Checker tool, we are making information available surrounding publishing options. So mainly at the moment, in order to navigate eligible and compliant options, I would say first port of call is really your library. but you can use the journal checker tool, and there is also the list at Sherpa Romeo on some of the approved transformative journals, or the approved transformative journals, and those are regularly updated. Monographs is fast approaching, so we are very aware that we need to do a similar set of activities in order to support the monographs policy. So we are now actively working on the model for the fund and how that will work, and also looking at the processes for the exceptions in the policy. So in particular, the third-party exception and also the suitable publisher exception, so that ourselves and the sector understand how to implement those, and they will be developed in partnership with experts and stakeholders. So that work is just about to kick off, and with a view to us publishing and sharing the mechanics, if you like, of the policy and those exceptions later this year in 2022. And with that, I shall end, apart from I just wanted to mention a couple of things in terms of some of the key questions that we have been hearing from people. So to be honest, the most common question has been around, where do I find out if something is a transformative agreement or a transformative journal? There's quite a few questions around what to do with corresponding author and how to manage that. And we're trying to be as flexible as possible. And then, of course, there are questions around author choice. And with that, I think we are, as I hope has come across, working really closely with JISC in terms of prioritising publisher agreements to make sure that there's maximum coverage. We've had quite a lot of questions around whether archive can be used as a compliant repository, which it can. Something which is quite challenging, which we're working on at the moment, is the kind of crossover between when is something a book chapter and when is something an article. And also we've had quite a lot of queries around data access statements, which actually I found quite fascinating, and I've learned a lot. So we're really just, you know, what formulates a good data access statement. I suppose first off, people are, is there a strict set of requirements, which there isn't. Obviously, we're working towards good practice. But I think we will be working with others to develop that practice collectively. It's been really interesting seeing different examples, and also some of the data centres that UKRI funds have also developed guides as well for authors. So yeah, those are some of the main questions that we've been receiving at the moment. So I think that's me. So back over to you, Masood.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That's absolutely superb, and has taken us through the journey of both the policy development, but also the support structures that are now in place from a funding perspective, but also from an organizational support perspective. I have to admit, the pandemic has completely changed my view about time. I thought the consultation was only happening about a year and a half ago. It almost feels it was 3 years ago, really. This is just absolutely odd.
Well, the consultation was only back then, but but the actual review started at end of 2018.
Aha, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have had quite a few questions. What I will try to do is group them and ask the right people that question. We've had questions on exactly those lines that you were mentioning, Rachel, about what does it mean in terms of licensing, what does it mean in terms of data access statements. If I may pick a question initially myself, because this might not be a question to you, which is, whether the author's version need to be uploaded at the date of acceptance or date of publication as suggested on the UKRI slides. Again, please feel free to correct me. I think the policy is requiring it at date of publication, but because institutional mandates might be at dates of acceptance, I think please do check what's appropriate within the context of your institution. This is primarily because institutions didn't want to confuse messaging. And if they've already had a date of acceptance messaging internally, they might have not changed it since then. Emily's just putting in the chat that at Sheffield, they asked to upload author accepted manuscript as soon as possible after acceptance. So it's not really, I mean, policy is looking at publication, final publication date, if I remember correctly, but nonetheless, your institutional policy might be slightly different. So please.
Very good point. We should probably cover some things like that within our FAQ as well, just to try and clarify that that's the policy, but your institution may ask this.
It's nice to see Waitrose libraries are all and universities are all aligned on our approach here, which is all about as soon as possible after date of acceptance. Okay, I'm going to pick up another question. Kevin's asked a question about the access statement that needs to be added for green root publication is the header page, which appears to be added by the Waitrose repository. I'm not sure I understand the question actually, but Nick, you may want to come in.
Yeah, I just thought I'd pick that up, Masood, because well, it wasn't in the question and answer, so I was aware it would get lost in the chat. So I think what he's just asking for clarification on the statement that Rachel referred to for rights retention. And Kevin's asking, does that automatically appended to the version in Waitrose, so I don't need to add it, but I don't think that's the case. It needs to be in the version that is going to the publisher when you actually submit it for publication. So just to clarify that, really.
That's very true, and thank you for picking that, Nick. I think it's fair to say that at the moment there are a few funding bodies that require that statement, including UKRI, but also Welcome, if I remember correctly. And I think there's another one which I can't remember now. Having said that, I know institutions are also looking at institutional policies on rights retention. And if you have an institutional policy, which as far as I know, none of the Waitrose universities have at this time, then that might again supersede that and support the funding council's policy at the same time. And Nick's also mentioned the EU in that regard. Okay, Rachel, if I may pick another question. So there's a question about someone who's a staunch advocate of open access publication and also particularly of true open access journals, which don't require APCs and require CC/BY licenses. But they also recognize that some subject area associations are finding it quite difficult for it to be economically sustainable. That particular model where there are no APCs associated. And they often ask money from the funding councils, but whereas some other associations are still making their money through subscription models. Does UKRI have any thoughts on how it might be possible to support the publishing ecosystem or the journal ecosystem to allow for more Root 1 publications, which make the version of record immediately open access? I'm just thinking this might be more related to learning societies, smaller societies, and other publishing agencies who don't necessarily have the model to go fully open access.
So I'm not sure I caught all of the details of the question there, Masood, but so it's around small specialist publishers that don't actually, or it doesn't appear economically viable for them to move to open access.
From a subscription model, indeed.
From a subscription model, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think in terms of, I suppose, our policy overall, when we've undertaken our analysis, most you're normally talking about 1 or 2 papers from a UKRI author in some of those, and so largely, I would anticipate that the green route is acceptable. And I know that the discussions that JISC has had with a number of the small publishers, they have said that they will accept the green publication for UKRI authors, because that seems to be the appropriate model for them, whilst they seek to move in the longer term to a sustainable open access model. I mean, I suppose from UKRI's perspective, we will be looking at the progress and monitoring these sorts of issues. We don't have special programs ourselves to support that transition, but we will be working through others, such as the community initiatives that are funded perhaps by the Red Fund and others, and also working with JISC in terms of support of transition to open access for a range of different publishers. So probably doesn't quite answer the question, but I think, you know, that's really our position.
That's really helpful, and I think there's more clarification coming on that question about that UKRI is concerned for the people that they're funding, and I think that makes sense. But if I may add to that, I think JISC and Universities UK is looking at the wider publishing landscape, including providing support for those smaller publishers or learning societies who are moving from a subscription model or entirely a new model from scratch.
Yeah, so I will say, I mean, what we have done and we are doing is we have actually, we supported that initial work by, I can't remember the name of, you know, Alicia and Elaine and Lorraine's company. What's it called? Anyway, so we supported the toolkit for learning societies, which is now formed into a piece of further work through Plan S, but that was initiated by UKRI and Wellcome. And so that identified about 20 different business models that could help small learning societies move to open access. So we have invested in those supporting structures and are working with ALPSP, you know, continually in terms of engaging in those models. But as you say, Masood, it's mainly via JISC. So part of our support through JISC is also to promulgate that kind of thing.
Thank you, Rachel. If I may pick another question, which is linked with one of the frequently asked questions you were mentioning in relation to corresponding authors. So what would you advise in the case where you're not the corresponding author and you're working with sometimes quite a large number of international co-authors, and the corresponding author is unwilling to include the licensing statement?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that, you know, when you enter into a research partnership, and also I accept, though, you may have entered a research partnership and then this policy has been introduced. But part of that is to make sure that everybody is aware of your obligations, really, in terms of your research funder. And I mean, thinking about that, I'd be quite surprised that someone wouldn't want to put that statement in. So I actually, in terms of, you know, the standard line would be, of course, you should make sure that these things were all resolved in your collaboration agreement, etc. But actually, I think we've got to take into account that this policy has been introduced, and you know, it's quite feasible that there will be collaborations already ongoing. I just wonder whether that's a very, you know, it's quite a hypothetical question, and I'd be interested to know what happens in practice and if that really is, you know, a real scenario. I can't imagine that why anyone would refuse to seek open access. But on the other hand, there are such a range of different options as well in which to publish that I would expect in most cases you can find an option that would be compliant with the policy. Do you have any other advice, or does Claire have any advice?
I must start by saying this is a question from a researcher in astrophysics, so that's all we know. So I'm not sure whether the person is on call and whether I want to add anything more to this. I think sometimes it could be linked with countries who haven't yet fully grasped why open access is as important, and they have sometimes unnecessary or within their context necessary fears about if we publish an author accepted manuscript now, that might undermine the importance of what we do.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, with, you know, I'm sure these are issues that we definitely want to track throughout the implementation of the policy. And so they're the sort of things, obviously, the unintended consequences, and we do want to understand those. And I think also it does relate to our approach in terms of monitoring and compliance, where obviously, you know, we're really trying to be intelligent about our monitoring and compliance. And so where people find themselves in situations, you know, you need to make all the efforts you can to meet the aims of the policy. And where there are real problems, then, you know, let's hear about them and see if we can resolve them.
Yeah, and Kevin's actually made a good point about some countries are still very, very particular about retaining their IP on the publications as well. So they might feel that by giving a free license, that IP is no longer there, etc. So things that we will learn over time as we implement this policy, and also the cultural aspects of that transition that come with that.
Yeah, and just on that, well, I mean, we did a piece of work with FCDO and the Department of Health, and, you know, that was one of the issues that came up. I mean, in particular, looking at lower and middle income countries and collaborations in ODA funding. And yeah, so we do recognise that, you know, there can be those, well, there's international context that needs to be taken into account.
Claire, anything you want to add to any of these questions so far before I move on to the next set of questions?
I think it sort of mirrors what Rachel said, that it is being clear, you know, when the policy comes out, of the benefits and why we're doing this, you know, rather than just, we need to include this language. It's, you know, why we're doing this, what the move is to open access, and then gathering that information so we can support researchers with those questions if they get asked them.
Okay, thank you. Right, this is a bit of a long question, so I'm going to try to condense this as much as I can, but apologies if I miss anything. So the question initially is highlighting that monographs, book chapters, and edited collections arising from UKRI training grants are currently exempt from the open access requirements under this policy. But UKRI still expect research organizations to support researchers to make such outputs open access. Unfortunately, book processing charges are not cheap, and local funding is not readily available for monograph publishing as well. So will grant recipients still be able to access UKRI's dedicated open access fund for monograph publishing from January 2024 for UKRI training grants based outcomes?
That is a very good question. I think, so as I mentioned, we are now actively developing the terms and conditions around the monograph fund. And as we develop that, we're going to consider different, you know, user stories to inform the way in which that fund should operate. And we will always be considering, you know, the issue of equity in policy, as we have in this policy development. So, we will be taking into account training grants, but on the other hand, obviously, we've got to balance the fact that where the mandate applies, we've got to support that mandate. So it's an issue we will be considering in the design of that fund. I can't say at the moment, you know, it's a definite yes or no, but we recognise it is a scenario that needs to be taken into account.
Thank you, Rachel. I think it goes without saying that this will be a transitionary state as well when that kicks in, and we'll see the implications of that both locally as well, but also nationally. There's a related question there, which I'll ask in two parts, if that's okay. One of them is about the mandate for monographs and essay collections to be open access from 1st of January 2024, and that you have a ring-fenced £3.5 million envelope to support that. There is a rough calculation done that if we take a book processing charge of about £10,000, that translates into about 350 monographs. What happens if there are more books being published? And I think let's just start there. What happens if there's more publishing than the funding?
Well, yeah, we'll gonna have to track this carefully. I would say, I think, you know, really the response on that is that setting that amount of funding and earmarking it was incredibly hard, because the data around monographs is incredibly poor. So in our case for funding, this looked like a reasonable allocation based on the data that we had around UKRI publications. Having said that, we obviously really want to try and encourage different models as well. And we know we are going to have to, again, just monitor and look at, you know, what happens. I think that as we introduce the policy in 2024, we'll reflect on what happens over that year with that fund, and that will inform what the approach will be in the following year. So we recognise this is new for us, you know, and it's we've been talking to other funders as well internationally. So the Austrian funders and Dutch funders that also have monograph funds. At the moment, ours looks as if it's going to be adequate, but we're a far bigger funder. So yeah, we need to monitor it carefully.
Okay, and very quickly, the second part of the same question is the block grant for monographs the right way of doing it? Could it not be through grant applications themselves where book processing charges are included in there?
So our conclusion was obviously that it needed to be a separate ring-fenced fund. One of the primary reasons for that is because when you put in your grant application, the likelihood of a monograph being published during the grant is slim, and it's more likely to come sometime after the grant. And in actual fact, in the review, there were many cases where, you know, you might find it's 2 or 3 years after the grant that a long form publication is published. Hence, one of the key reasons as to why having a separate fund has been the case. Also, I think the fact that we want to look at ways in which we can engage with researchers and the research sector to be a bit more strategic in the way in which monographs are supported to be open access. So I think that was one of the other reasons as to why a centralised fund seemed to be the best approach.
Thank you. I will pick another question now, and this is a recent question. So does UKRI have any infrastructure plans, particularly as an open research platform to facilitate immediate open access publishing in similar lines to what Wellcome and European Union has done?
Well, my answer to that is really easy, no. What I will say is, obviously we are engaged in discussions with many different funders, and so we can see that in some cases this seems to have been really quite successful. Recognise at the moment the European Commission are looking at Open Research Europe and seeing if that can be used by other funders. From UKRI's perspective, and when we were thinking about this and infrastructure for publishing, we are not a publisher, but we provide infrastructure for the research life cycle, and you'll see, I think Octopus has already been mentioned today. So for our view, when considering this early on in the open access review, was we considered it out of scope for this open access policy and review, because we saw it really as more of an open science question, where you're really talking about the whole research life cycle. So I think, it could be something that we consider, but it would be within that wider open science umbrella. And Octopus is one innovation in that space, but really it's how do you support the whole research life cycle and all assets.
Thank you. And I know from discussion with colleagues that there are differing views on that. Like some people really want something centralized so that it's easy for them to publish in a single place. And a lot of people, when they think about scalable open infrastructures, they realize that no single infrastructure can actually scale at that level. And actually we need a whole ecosystem of that. So I really appreciate your response on that. We are now going to move to a couple of thematic questions on licensing, which as a lot of us know is quite a common recurring aspect of these conversations. If I may pick probably an easier question in that regard first, which is on conference proceedings. So conference proceedings are less likely to be included in transitional agreements, and therefore they may not be eligible for the same kind of funding as you will get from read and publish deals. They often have copyright transfer agreements that prohibit sharing with a CC BY license. So the question is, can we clarify whether or not they would be eligible for funding from the block grant? And if not, what would you advise the researchers do?
I hope I've got this answer right. You said it was an easy question, so you can correct me. But I mean, I think in that case, I would advise you not to sign the copyright transfer agreement and to make sure that you've got the Route 2 wording in your submission. I think that would be my advice. Is that the right answer, Masood?
I think that's the right answer from a policy viewpoint, but I think there are multiple facets in my view to this. And again, I'll need to do a bit more digging as well. Firstly, I think at a national level, and you would know this, Rachel, we are trying to include conference proceedings into the read and publish deals because we think they're an integral part of the publishing life cycle, particularly in STEM subjects, and therefore they should be part of the read and publish deals. So that's the very first thing I would like to highlight. The second thing I was going to say is, of course, this will also depend on what your institutional position is. So some institutions may have localized funds that might support publishing. But if you are UKRI funded, then there is a policy compliance aspect that needs to be met. And that's what Rachel was highlighting. So please do speak. The easy answer I can give on this is please do speak with your wonderful library team who probably knows this more inside out than myself or Rachel. Claire, do you have any comment on that, or am I putting you on the spot on that one?
I think it is get in touch, let us know who it is you're publishing with. As we've said, there's negotiations happening with IEEE, but it's knowing who it is, especially if it's pulled into a publisher, is really useful for us to know where we are with negotiations and support you with those.
I will just say as well, I mean, I do know that, in fact, yeah, we're in liaison with the negotiating team at the moment, and I know it's very active, the IEEE negotiations, but the team at JISC are also analysing all of the agreements that they do have in place and the prospective agreements to see where conference proceedings are covered or aren't covered, so that we've got a better take on that issue as well.
Thank you. I think it's also worth adding that speaking with your library team might allow you to adjust things in a way that allow publishing for us. So what I can't get from the question is whether this particular scenario, the restriction was about the CC BY license, and a CC BY ND might have been allowed. I can't pick that from the question, but if you speak with your teams, they can then dig those kind of details out and allow and at least give you what's permissible within the policy landscape. What they will also be able to tell you is where we are with any kind of transitionally or transition agreements with those publishers. So for example, it might be a very different situation with Springer versus IEEE versus Elsevier versus wherever else conference proceedings might be published. So it's definitely well advised to speak with your team, because they'll have the most up-to-date information at that time.
And just to add, and because we do speak often to each other and share this information, so it's really helpful for us to understand what's happening with publishers at a national picture, not just locally.
Okay, brilliant. So the next question is, I assume from an arts and humanities department, particularly history of art context behind it, and this is about third-party copyright. And we know from our own personal experience that we do get these questions quite a bit on this point. So the question is that the policy currently states that research articles and long-form publications published under a CC license can include third-party materials that are subject to a more restrictive license. So that's a policy statement that's in there. But commentators such as Martin Eve have said that downstream redistribution of such works would not be possible under the terms of a CC license without violating third-party copyrights. Comprehensive right clearance can be prohibitively expensive. We know that checking all the images, for example, in a monograph it can be a very, very difficult thing to do. So could UKRI be doing more to address this, aside from acknowledging that reuse permissions cannot always be obtained, and that work may not be made open access as a result?
Yeah, very good question. And we do recognise that downstream complexity. And this is one of the pieces of work that's just starting, which is to try and examine third-party right issues and workflows to inform the implementation of the monographs policy. Which is around the management of that exception, but also more so just the management of third-party rights in long-form publications. However, there is obviously this wider issue of third-party materials and how can they be, I suppose, more easily open and reused. And I think a lot of the work that's going on in supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, so the National Collection activity, is also looking at wider third-party rights issues. So we are going to be, if you like, joining those two bits up to try and examine, because it's not all within, if you like, the open access policies remit. I think it's, it's a broader question, and strategically we need to work in a broader landscape and with other partners really to try and make that happen, both libraries, museums, the cultural heritage sector, as well as looking at the way in which the immediate policy might work, if that answers the question.
That's really helpful.
But yes, we should be doing more. We're doing as much as we can, and would also, to be honest, it would be great. I don't know if we know who asked that question, but we're also, we want to engage and talk to people to understand some of the issues. So if whoever it was that asked that question wishes to be engaged in that work, then please make yourself known to the UKRI team. We'll be happy to speak to you.
That's brilliant. And I'm sure many scholars from arts and humanities would be interested in that. So we'll pick that up locally. I will pick up a couple of questions very quickly. I'm wary of time as well. So the first one is about, I think David's put some comments in the chat about, again, the funding envelope and arts and humanities publishing. I wonder, Rachel, if you can clarify that what you're not suggesting is that book process in charge would be the only way to publish monographs open access.
We are not suggesting that, no. We want to try and work out a way in which other models can be supported. It is quite challenging because, like yourselves, we all work in organisations with particular systems and processes in place, and rules and legal rules and all of those things. So we have to take quite a lot of different considerations into account. I've learned a lot since joining UKRI. Into account in establishing a process, but we are starting from the premise that we want to be as flexible and innovative as we can, and to support as many models as we can. Now, how far we can be at that end of the spectrum and how far we end up at this end of the spectrum, I can't say. I want us to be as far as we can down at this end. So that's the aspiration.
That's really helpful. And I think it's also worth adding that UKRI is one part in this larger scheme where there will be QR funding questions here. There will be other publishers and other funding councils and how we get support from them, because monograph publishing is as wide as with articles.
Yeah, and I think that, we're very conscious of the fact that really from UKRI, we're just a very small piece within monograph publishing. It is much broader, and it's really going to be, the REF and institutions and a whole range of other funders which will be supporting this space.
Yeah, but as David said, it is a bit terrifying at the moment, not knowing all the answers, but I'm sure we'll get there together. And I think that's the power of the community and working together on this. Okay, I'm going to ask one very last question and then conclude this because I'm really wary of time. So very easy question, Rachel, and I'm being very sarcastic there. Is this policy actually pushing researchers towards big publishers with transitional agreements rather than smaller non-UK journals, for example, university presses in the US or somewhere else, because of the uncertainty of whether the licensing statement will be accepted? Any thoughts?
My thought is that I could see how someone may raise that question. I think that the way we have implemented the policy and support has really not been with that in mind. One of the reasons for the additional support to JISC has been actually to extend engagement for a whole variety of publishers. I think they are very busy. So for example, those national negotiations have normally focused, because of the UK publishing pattern, they've normally focused on 8 publishers. Okay, I'm exaggerating, probably to 14, right? Big journal publishers. You're now looking at a far larger number of publishers that JISC is engaging. So they've got the long list where UKRI authors publish, and they are actually engaging with that broad long list, which includes a whole diversity. So the intention is to be inclusive. But you know, I can see why that question would be asked. I would say that actually, you know, our publishing patterns already are dominated in those publishers, and so what we've really got to do, and what the sector has been doing, is trying to make the agreements with those publishers as open as possible, transparent as possible, and as affordable as possible, so that there is actually money to engage with other publishers, because otherwise that spend would just be out of control.
Thank you. Claire, any thoughts from yours end before I conclude the session?
No, just to say a huge thanks to Rachel for her time today.
Thank you. Just one comment before I bring this to a close, and I think that comment is the kind of diversity of ecosystem of publishing that we want to go into for an open access world to really thrive. And that will be through the big publishers, but that will also be through lots of learning societies, lots of small publishers, different models of publishing. And that will also require a shift in search culture locally as well. I think there is a lot of emphasis on, or at least there has been in the past, a lot of emphasis on, if you publish here, that's more prestigious than if you publish there. And I think we need to really start thinking about quality of research based on the work you're doing rather than where it's being published. And that's a significant shift we all need to make locally and institutionally. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Rachel Bruce, who's joined us and given her immense valuable time of hers, and has taken us through some of these questions as well. I think it's just really good to have some clarity directly from the source. So we really appreciate that, Rachel. I think it's fair to say that we will still be learning through this process. And I think I would highly encourage all of the colleagues here, if you're still unclear about something, speak with your teams, but also actually provide some feedback directly to UKRI as well. They're always keen to listen, they're always keen to collaborate, and they're constantly developing and adapting. And I'm sure there will be more clarifications that will support the future iterations of this strategy and hopefully the REF stance as well. So just want to say thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. The session's been recorded and will be shared. If there is, so there's a question actually on, would you please share the resources that have been posted in the chat today? Nick, if you can actually save the chat, that might be really helpful in that regard. And just a huge thank you to everyone who's actually helped organize this as well. So Claire, Rachel, Ben, Emily, Nick, and the whole team who's been doing this in the background as well. Really appreciate your time. Have a lovely rest of the day and have a good weekend, everyone. Take good care of yourselves. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Bye.